Welcome everyone. Are you all ready for a session on the rights and responsibilities of grad student researchers? Yes? Yes? Good? Good? Okay. Why offer such a workshop? These are key issues for any graduate student. Maybe you're part of a research group and you feel like your efforts in a collaborative project are not being acknowledged in terms of authorship. You want to talk about that, you want to explore that. Maybe you're involved in research with animals and you need to know about the ethical guidelines that apply to you. You say, nothing applies to me, I'm just going to do whatever I want. I'm going to go work with mice or rats or whatever. I don't have to bother with the rules. Well, of course you do. And there are tons of guidelines that will be relevant to your research in that regard. Or maybe you're submitting some of your culminating projects, maybe a master's thesis to the graduate college, and you've plagiarized, God forbid, then Meg might crack down on you if such things happen. But it's just to say there are a host of issues that you might want to explore with respect to the rights and responsibilities of being a graduate student researcher. A number of universities, from Johns Hopkins to CU to UCLA, have guidelines, even almost like a Bill of Rights, that cover this kind of background. Why? Because enough people realize it's helpful to have guidance in terms of what you should expect as a graduate student researcher, but also what you're responsible for. Maybe if you feel like you're being asked to do too much in the lab, too many hours and so forth, you need to have some kind of guidance in terms of what to do in light of some of these considerations, including if there's a legitimate disagreement with an advisor, let's say, for which you need some kind of grievance process. So in today's workshop, we've got terrific panelists that will cover a gamut of issues with respect to this topic. We're going to start off with Dr. Lori Olafson, who's in the Office of Research Integrity, but that means she oversees the IRB, right, at UNLV. Many of you have already met her or will meet her. She will be central to your life and your research success. Dr. Kinney from psychology was not able to make it today, but he has been able to pass the baton to Chelcie Heaney, who is a Ph.D. student in psychology for a few more months, right?
Yeah.
And then you'll be Dr. Heaney.
Yes.
And then she'll do neurobiological experiments on your brain if you're a rat.
Yes.
Is that right? Not if you're a human. So you're okay, all of you in this room. But she's able to talk about some of the issues with respect to being a graduate student researcher in a collaborative lab group, but also working with animals and so forth. And then third, we'll have Meg Wilson from the Graduate College, who's able to share again some of the expertise she sees from her bird's eye view in the grad college. There are a number of issues that are kind of recurring, but also just some other pointers she'll have. So with all that said, thanks for joining us.
So as Dr. Gray said, I'm Lori Olson from the Office of Research Integrity. Before I came to the Office of Research Integrity, I was an associate professor over in the educational psychology department. So that's where some of you have seen me or taken some of my classes, which I'm not doing anymore. And my background was in the social behavior end of the IRB. So I used to co-chair the social behavioral IRB. And that's how I got my arm twisted into taking over this position on a temporary basis 3 years ago. You know how those things work at UNLV, right? I'll talk a little bit about the Office of Research Integrity. So as Dr. Gray mentioned, one of the things that I do is oversee the IRB and the staff. So some of you have worked with the staff over on the third floor in human subjects, so that's Cindy Lee Tatasio, some of you have worked with, and Krista Esparza and Dax Miller. So those are our three staff members in Office of Research Integrity Human Subjects side. They're not the IRB, so I like to say that to students when you complain about the IRB, those are not the people who are making the decisions. Right? The decisions are being made by the actual IRB, right? So we have 4 chairs, co-chairs on the biomedical and on the social behavioral side of things, and they're the ones that are making the decisions. And sometimes if it goes to the fully convened board, and some of your studies have been there, and I'm looking at in the back corner there, then the study's reviewed by the entire board. But those decisions are not made by myself or by the staff. So people say, oh, I'm going over to see the IRB. It's like, no, you're not. You're coming over to see Office of Research Integrity Human Subjects. So that's part of what we do. But In kind of a broad overview, my office is there primarily to ensure that and to help researchers, faculty, and students to help people understand what their responsibilities are, and to kind of make sure that the federal regulations, and there are lots of them, that everybody's following those. So that's kind of the broad mission, is to ensure that we have research with integrity happening at UNLV. And as I said, we assist researchers to comply with any federal regulation, state law, UNLV policy. And I'll talk about some of those in just a minute. So in addition to supporting the IRB, we also support the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, and Chelsea's going to talk about that in a minute, right?
Okay.
Soon. And the Institutional Biosafety Committee, and all of the safety committees related to research. So the Accelerator Safety Committee, the Chemical Safety Committee, so we do all of those kinds of things. We also provide training and programs for assisting again in ethical conduct of research. So we do RCR training, we do conflict of interest training, and then the last thing that we do in my office, second last thing, but we're also responsible for export control policy, which likely doesn't affect most of you, maybe not any of you. And then finally, we implement the research misconduct policy when necessary. So that's what my office does, all of those things. But today we're talking about researcher responsibilities. And even though the presentation was titled Rights and Responsibilities, you're not going to see any slides here where I talk about what are your rights. That's more in the graduate college side of things. And in the compliance world where I come from, we talk about research as a privilege, not a right. And that's been determined by the federal courts. So you do not have a right to conduct research, neither do our faculty members. It's a privilege, right? And so it's the institution that gives individuals the opportunity to conduct research once those individuals have notified us that they're willing to comply with federal, state, institutional policy. So that's the number one point. You don't have the right to conduct research at UNLV. It's a privilege. So I'm going to focus mostly on then what are your responsibilities as student researchers. And researcher responsibilities come from 4 different sources. I'm going to talk about all of these: your professional codes, government regulations, institutional policies, and then your personal convictions. I advanced it myself. So a really good place to begin is with your professional societies or organizations. So one, for example, is the American Anthropology Association, AAA. They have a statement on ethics. The APA, so if you're in education or psychology, certainly, they have a fairly extensive ethical principles and code of conduct. It's not just about how to be an ethical psychologist, but how to conduct ethical research. So for example, one of their missions is to promote accuracy, honesty, and truthfulness in science, teaching, and practice of psychology. The American Institute of Biological Sciences has an ethics statement, that's up there as well. Conduct research and teaching in a manner that's consistent with accepted scientific and teaching methods, making sure that you have the highest standards of honesty and integrity in all that you do. The American Society for Microbiology has a code of ethics. It doesn't matter where you go. I just pulled 4 examples, guessing who the audience might be. But anywhere you go, you're going to find a code of ethics in your field. So that's a great place to look at initially for what are my responsibilities as a researcher. They're pretty clear. Another place to look, which is maybe a little less fun, federal regulations. So if you're working with IRB, you'll hear us talk about 45 CFR 46. So that's the Code of Federal Regulations for the Protection of Human Research Subjects. And so all of our lengthy policies and procedures and standard operating procedures all stem from the Code of Federal Regulations. And at UNLV, it says that all human subjects research conducted by faculty, staff, and students, this is out of the policy, must be approved by the UNLV Institutional Review Board before the research project can begin. Right, so that's students, faculty, staff. And I'll talk a little bit more about the IRB in a minute. Some other regulations that are applicable, the Animal Welfare Act. And there's a little description there about the animal, and all of this stuff is on our website too, by the way. I didn't make handouts because this information is readily accessible. I can't provide handouts if you want them.
That's okay, no, websites, that's a good point.
Websites are good. And also the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare through NIH. There's the Public Health Service Policy on humane care. There's a typo, humane care and use of laboratory animals. Thank you, spell check, fix that. So those are the two sets of federal regulations that govern you if you're working with animals. And then if you are doing anything through the Institutional Biosafety Committee, those guidelines come also from NIH. Guidelines for research involving recombinant or synthetic nucleic acid molecules. So again, those are just some of the federal regulations that direct us in how to develop our policies so that students and faculty are conducting their research in an ethical manner. Okay, so that's your kind of the broad overview. First you have the professional organizations, then you have lots and lots of federal regulations, and then we get into researcher responsibilities, our institutional policies, and there are lots of those as well. So the two that I felt were most applicable to today's sessions would be the principal investigator eligibility policy. So according to that policy, students cannot be in the principal investigator role. It always needs to be a faculty member. So that's clearly outlined. There are cases where if it's not a full-time faculty member, you can apply to have PI eligibility on a project basis, and that gets signed off on by the vice president for research. So you would, if you're working as like a center director and you're not full-time or you don't have a Ph.D., you can always apply to become a PI for a particular project. And of course, before he signs those, he comes and talks to us. So there's the PI eligibility policy, only full-time faculty members can be a PI. So that's even for your dissertations and theses. So even though it's your work, it has to be a PI signing off on it. This is from the IRB form. And some of you might not have read it very carefully, but on this one, the faculty advisor signs off on your research project. So they're the PI, they are the principal investigator, and we ask them to sign this, this signature. We don't call it a signature, we call it a, who remembers what it's called on the form? It's called this assurance, signature of assurance. So these are the things that your faculty member is agreeing to do for you. So it's way too small on my little handout here. So your faculty member says, I agree to act as the liaison between the IRB and the student fellow investigator with all written and verbal communications. That one's really important because, as you heard, I have a staff of 3 people. We have over 1,000 active protocols. Many of those are with students. And so we have recently made the decision that I've asked my staff not to spend 2 and 3 hours at a time with individual students helping you with your protocols. It's your faculty advisor's responsibility. I mean, I just don't have the staff to do that. And I'm sure you can see that. Plus, your faculty, your PI, is signing off that they understand what it is that you're doing. And so if they're not involved in the process, I'm not that comfortable with letting them be a PI if they have no idea what it is that you're doing. Yes?
But if there is something related to the project that you call the office to ask about, that doesn't have to go through the PI, that's okay, right?
No, that's
This is just
fine.
official communication.
The official communication and sitting in the office for 3 hours and
Yeah.
asking my staff to help you fill out your
Yeah.
protocol proposal
Okay.
form. And that's been happening a lot lately. Yeah. So, and that's more to do with the PI and not with the grad students. So when we've been going out and doing sessions, we've been really clear, I think you heard that with as we go out and talk about our mission, is that you really need to have your PI involved in your protocol submission, right? So, was there another question? Yeah.
I've kind of have like a little bit of a delay in my data collection. It's just like completely stalled. And I'm doing survey research and it's like, they're not answering it. And I know it's like a individual case by case, but I do see where it says arrange for alternate faculty or advisor to assume responsibility if they're unavailable or on sabbatical leave or vacation.
Right.
So if I had to continue collecting data through the summer, would that apply?
If your PI is not available,
Yeah.
it would
Okay.
apply.
All right.
So, and that's in there because, as you pointed out, we've had cases where a faculty member has been on sabbatical for a year and their student is here collecting data, and there's that lack of oversight. So typically when we see compliance problems, it's due to a lack of oversight from the PI, right? So from the student's perspective, if you feel that you are, out there collecting data, you can't talk to anybody about, I've had this issue, what should I do now? That's a problem from my perspective. So you need to be able to access a PI at all times. It also says, this is what your PI is agreeing to. They're signing this. I agree to meet with the student investigator on a regular basis to monitor the progress of the study. I agree to be available and to personally supervise the student in solving problems as they arise. I assure that the student investigator will promptly report adverse events. I'll arrange for an alternate faculty member. I assure that the student investigator will follow through with storage and destruction. And that's what your PIs are signing off on. I don't believe, and as a PI I've signed off on many of these, I'm not certain that a lot of our PIs or faculty members are reading that really carefully anymore. And again, as we go out and talk, as you know, we're doing the new IRB submission system. So we're going out to a lot of different departments, having a lot of information and training sessions. And so we're reminding faculty that it is their responsibility to monitor and to be heavily involved in your research protocols. So that's what your PIs are signing off on. So it's good for you to know what it is they're saying, that they say that they're going to do. We also, related to institutional policies, we have required training. So on the human subject side of things, all researchers, all research team members, students and faculty need to complete the CITI training. There's lots of different modules available. There's biomedical and there's also social behavioral. That training is good for 5 years. It used to be 3 years, but now it's 5, so that's better. And then you have to retrain. If you're working on an animal protocol, you need to do LATA training. So that's students as well. And if your name is on a protocol, then Kevin Bergeron, who's the administrator, will check to make sure that you have done your training. If you're funded through NIH or NSF, you're also required to do responsible conduct of research training, and we offer that every fall. That's fairly extensive. I think some of you done that before? No? Okay. So that's 8 hours of face-to-face training, and that's the minimum outlined by the feds, that there has to be this 8-hour face-to-face component. And then there's also an additional online component. And if you're interested, you can do the online training anytime. It's also through CITI. So those are just a few of the institutional policies, and there are many, many more, all available on our Research Integrity website. And then this is the final test of being a responsible researcher, and this comes from Nick Stenick's book. He's written like the guidebook on responsible conduct of research. So this is what he says: if you're uncertain whether what you're doing is responsible or not, subject it to the one simple test. So imagine if what you're doing is going to appear on the front page of the RJ tomorrow. Would you be comfortable with your family and your friends and your colleagues seeing that? So that's just a quick test of whether or not you feel that you've acted responsibly. So if you're nervous about having something on the front page of the RJ, maybe you need to go back and have a look at being a more responsible researcher. And that is all that I have.
So we'll turn it over now to Chelcie Heaney, and then there will be plenty of time for questions and continued discussion too.
So I don't have anything nearly as extensive as Lori. I found out about this yesterday. So I kind of have a little bit on both sides of rights and responsibilities. A lot of the responsibilities was, proper training, which Lori covered really well. So all of this is coming from a researcher who works exclusively with animals. So some of this may not be applicable, but may be, I don't know. I know there's a lot of certification that needs to go on to work with human subjects, but there's a lot of certification that needs to go on to work with animal subjects as well. And if you are planning on publishing your data, then you need to be able to collect some of that data, right? To be involved in that research in some way, shape, or form, and therefore you need to be certified in any and all aspects in order to make sure that you're fully qualified to collect all of that data. On top of that, and I think the last PowerPoint slide that Lori had was a great example of this, you also need to know when ethics have been violated. So with animal research, we are just as regulated as people who work with humans. We have to treat the animals humanely. We have very strict guidelines of what we can and cannot do. We have to justify our use of the animals, the number of animals that we use, what we can do with them. All of that goes through a very similar process as with IRB, except ours is IACUC, so care and use of animals. And so we have to write up our entire protocol, just like you would working with humans, and that goes through a committee. They have to approve it. If they have questions, if they want something changed, we have to do that and change it before anything can actually be done. And part of that too is understanding, right, what you can and cannot do. On top of that, we tend to use some hazardous materials sometimes as well. So on top of that, we also have hazardous material training. And that's more of like a right of research, right? So to know what materials you're working with that are potentially harmful to you. And something that's also hammered into anybody that comes into our lab is that you have the right to ask questions about the research that is going on in your lab. Not only in your lab, but since we do work with animals, we work inside the animal facility, and so we see other research going on. And if something seems odd to you that someone else is doing, you have the right to ask them, what are you doing with those animals? And they need to be able to tell you their protocol, what they have outlined in their research to do with their animals. And if somebody is not open with you about what they're doing, what they've been, what their protocol has been allowed them to do, that should be a huge red flag. So with our research, we tend to have small components that culminate into something larger, and a lot of the times researchers in our lab may only see bits and pieces and may not therefore see the big picture. And I'm not sure if that will translate, but you still need to be able to, if your PI has asked you to run a particular experiment or survey, you have the right to know where that is in the big picture. I guess you guys don't technically work in labs, right? But in where that's going, right? And even if I know you need to be blinded for certain conditions, but that doesn't mean you can't know, the purpose of the research, the goal of the research, and if someone's refusing to tell you that, that should be a huge red flag, right? So, kind of switching gears towards authorship, it's really important that you sit down with your PI prior to starting any research to discuss what is expected of you in order to be on a paper. Particularly workload, do you need to have a certain number of hours per se in order to be considered for for authorship? Is it, you need to run X number of studies before you can be considered for authorship? Or is it simply like, just because this is your thesis work, does that qualify you enough, to be on the paper? In order to have that clear understanding before you move forward is really essential, right? Because then once you've done the work and then you sit down to have that conversation and then your PI's like, it's not quite enough, it's not what I was really expecting of you, and then you're kind of like blindsided, right? And you're like, well, what can I do now? And I've heard stories of students in my department where similar things have happened, where they've run studies and then their PI basically just takes all that data and then publishes without that student being on the paper, and that can be very demoralizing, right? As a researcher, like, you have put in a lot of time and effort and now you're not even really being acknowledged for it. So definitely, have that hard conversation before anything starts. On top of that too is if you're working with other people and whether or not they're going to be included in that paper as well. So my lab, we have currently 3 graduate students and about 10 undergraduate research assistants. And for the graduate students, it's a given that we'll all be named on any research that we have had a part in, because we all do pretty much equal shares of the work, and will help each other help to process the information and the data and help to run those experiments. For our undergraduate research assistants, it's very rare for those students to actually be named on a paper, but we have outlined for them that if they, contribute a complete data set that is essential to the work, then we have that conversation with them of like, okay, well, now you have done enough work to be a co-author, and usually they end up, kind of in the middle, right? They're never going to be first author. But oftentimes too, we present at conferences and their names go on those posters, so it's recognition for them there as well. Something else too is don't expect that everybody that's working on your project is going to work as hard as you. This is something that comes up a lot, right? Like, especially if it's your pet project, right? Like, you're obviously going to be very driven to get that done, to make sure it's done correctly, to make sure you're getting your data in on time. And even if you have other people helping you, they may think that they're putting in as much or enough work, and then you might think that they didn't put enough time to help or to be an author on that paper, but your PI might have, so there may be, a little bit of headbutting there as well. And ultimately, well, at least in my experience, your PI has the last word on that, right? So even if you feel completely 100% justified in your reasoning that this person doesn't deserve to be on this paper, if your PI says they do, then, and they have actually done work for it, it's not like somebody can just come in and be like, I have never seen this person before, and then they can be on the paper. But it is common that, not everybody shares work equally and still will end up on a paper, which is, again, something that you should talk to your PI about before you begin any of this work, right? So not only what are your responsibilities, but if other people are going to be named on the paper, what will they have to contribute, and what is like their threshold to be on the paper as well. Authorship position. So I think I've actually been really lucky with my PI in that he's actually pushed us to be first authors on a number of papers. Typically, if it's been our thesis or dissertation work and we can get that published, we are first author and he will take last author position. It also depends on your field, I believe, too. So I think in like medical research, I think last author position is more coveted than first author position. But in other lines of research, first author is typically the one that you're aiming for. So that would be something else that you would want to talk to your PI about before starting, right? Especially if this is your project, particularly for your master's or dissertation, that you're ultimately putting in, 99% of the work and analysis time and then writing everything up, then it should be that you have that top billing line, right? But your PI may not see it that way, so again, don't let yourself be sidelined by that when you write everything up and then your PI is like, nope, this is my lab, this is technically my work, I'm taking full credit for it, which again, I've heard stories of it happening. So I don't know if it necessarily needs to be in writing. I've never encountered any problems with this where like my PI said one thing and then, something else happens, but I don't know if that might be something that would be helpful for you guys, even if it's just like, in an email, just confirming what we talked about so that you have something to point to, if you need to take it for a grievance process or something. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have.
Okay, well, that's excellent. We'll turn over to Meg Wilson now. You have a fancy thing to show us, right?
I'm actually not going to show the fancy
Oh, you're
thing
not?
today
Okay.
because I did a test drive of the fancy thing and it doesn't work in this venue very well.
Oh,
So what's going to happen is you're going to get an email over the weekend with the fancy thing, and I'm going to actually link in all the IRB websites that Lori talked about, so you'll all have access to that on that. So leading off with what Lori said with the RJ test, remember you're working with humans. All your social scientists, so remember you're working with humans. So anything that you wouldn't want done to your kid or your mom or your sister or your niece or nephew, unless you're a sociopath, please keep that in mind. The other thing about the RJ test to keep in mind is if you were publishing back in 1998, your thesis or dissertation, or you were putting your thesis or dissertation out into the library here at UNLV in 1998, it wouldn't be a big deal. The only people who would really view your dissertations are people who come to the library, check it out, look at it. Maybe somebody across the country decides, I really want to look at that dissertation, well, they have to fill out an interlibrary loan form. If somebody's not returned your book, then, oh well, no one's going to be able to check it out. But now it's going to be ubiquitous. It's going to be on ProQuest. It's going to be on the digital archive, which is free to everybody. So any one of your students, especially if you're going into academia, can check up and see what you wrote and can check up and see what your research is. So you need to kind of bring your A game to the table when you're doing your thesis or dissertation, especially with your research, because the door's way open for people to question what you've done. It's no longer, oh, I did this little thesis at UNLV and no one's ever going to see it. People can see it. So on that line, one of the things that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to document with your thesis or dissertation. That's one of your responsibilities. So in your appendices section, if you're working with human subjects, you're going to want to put in all of your IRB approval forms. You're going to want to put in all your permission forms or release forms, or at least a sample of them. And you're going to want to put in your data. If you have a huge database or an SPSS database or Excel sheets that you don't want to actually print out, you can put it in electronically into ProQuest. You can put it in electronically into your document via, you put a page like Appendix E, CCD A3, and you just put a copy of the CD in with your document. If you don't want to put your data in with your document, but your advisor or your advisor doesn't want you to do that because it'll make your document huge. Some people have data sets that go 600-700 pages, which is completely understandable. I recommend that you hold on to that document. We live in a really techno-savvy world. We live in a world where memory is everywhere. You can buy a 2 terabyte hard drive right now over at Costco for $80, which is huge. So it's not that hard to put your data on a hard drive and just keep it in case you need it, because what will happen is because your data's out there, because your document's out there, people can always come back and say, okay, well, I want to see your data. I want to see how you arrived at this. And depending on whether or not you can provide that, they can possibly challenge the validity of your thesis or dissertation. Going into that, we also have plagiarism, which we touched on a little bit at the beginning, and this goes into co-authorship. So there's going to be 3 types of plagiarism you need to watch out for. There's the direct plagiarism everybody knows about, which is where you just steal somebody else's stuff. There's self-plagiarism, which you need to be mindful of. If you've published anything and you're using it in your thesis or dissertation, you need to let us know, you need to document. You need to be very clear that you're using that material. You need to tell us where it's been published, how it's been used before. There's also plagiarism involving a co-author. If you're using co-authored work, you have to give them full credit. You can't be like, oh, wait, so I'm first author on this, and it's my thesis dissertation, my thesis research, and like someone helped me with such and such work, and normally they'd have authorship, but since it's my thesis or my dissertation, I'm just going to conveniently leave them off. And everybody who contributes to your work needs to be included. Even if it's just in something small and you put them in the acknowledgement section, so and so inspired me with their work on X. If for some reason plagiarism is found to have happened, or faulty research is found to happen, what will happen is your degree will be revoked. And if you're in academia, the institution you're working at will be contacted and informed that your degree has been revoked. And depending on the veracity of your committee members, and your department, there's a very good probability they will then go forward and contact any journals you've published this information in, any place where it appears, so it can be retracted. So how do we avoid that? We're going to cite, we're going to give clear credit, we're going to get approvals if we use other people's stuff. One thing to keep in mind, and by other people's stuff, that can mean anything from their writing, their research, to if you're doing human subject stuff, if you take images of your subjects and you publish them. You need releases for that. In the state of Nevada, you own your own image. So we're in one of the few states in the union where if you publish my image without my consent, and I don't really like that, and I give you a cease and desist order, and you don't cease and desist having my image on something, I can then take you to court. So those are all the fun responsibility things. So there's happier stuff, honest, there's happier stuff. So when you publish, the standard UNLV publishing route for your thesis or dissertation is you upload to ProQuest, and then you also upload to, and then that information is transferred over to the digital archive. For ProQuest, your information is accessible only to people who have a ProQuest account. That's usually an institution like a law firm, a university, a government office. So they'll have a ProQuest account. They can look at anything that's on ProQuest. They have unlimited use. It's usually used for academic research. For the UNLV Digital Archive, anybody who has an internet connection can access your work, which can be good or bad, depending on what kind of work you're doing. So if for some reason you don't want people to have access to your work, you're going to want to file an embargo. Embargoes come in 1, 2, and 3-year terms with an option to renew. With the embargo, your embargoes are tricky, which is why we're going to go into the next section really quick. You have different types of copyright, which is something to keep in mind. So you have a standard copyright that everybody knows about, which is, I wrote this, it belongs to me, these are my original ideas. Then you have an idea of a trademark. So if you've developed some kind of research tool, you're gonna wanna get that trademarked. That's slightly different, so that's if you don't want people to be using your tool without your express permission or without paying you some sort of fee, you're gonna wanna trademark that. And then we get into open source and open access. So open access is pretty much the digital archive. Anybody can access it, anybody can look at it, anybody can use it as a jumping off point for their research in terms of they're using you as a source. Open access, it goes a little bit further, and that's a slightly different copyright, and that would be your actual research you're allowing people to access and use in their research. And this is really good if you want someone to replicate your study. This is really good if you want to do a longitudinal study with several other people. So during your dissertation, you do this subset of people that you're doing research on, and then your friend who's a year or 2 years behind you uses your open access research for their baseline, and then they do a similar data set on a different group, and then you just go forward like that. So you could have 3 or 4 people over the course of a time in an institution or multiple institutions looking at a similar sample group. And the ProQuest and Digital Archive are not open access. People don't have access to your data. You have to give them access to they have access to your research, they have access to your results, they have access to your written interpretation of the data, but they don't have direct access to your data set, and they can't use your data set in their work unless you give them permission. As far as embargoes go, my recommendation if you're considering academic publishing or a trademark is just get a 3-year embargo. After that amount of time, if most academic publishers only really hold you to keeping your information private for about 3 years. Most trademarks happen within about a year and a half to get off the ground, so it doesn't take a lot of time to actually get them off the ground and going. And finally, the other reason why I recommend a limited embargo versus an unlimited embargo where you would renew and say, no, I need this like kept away and sealed in a vault forever and ever and ever, because if it gets out, it's going to cause major issues for me or society. Because I am such an evil genius that it can't go out there. A good idea of having that limited embargo is if you've already academically published something after 3 years, it's out there. Anybody can find it on the net. They can find it in Google Scholar. They can find it using various search engines. It's findable. It's not hidden. It's not sealed away. So that embargo after 3 years, if you've published academically, really isn't doing anything to keep your work away from the masses. Also, it's a really great incentive to get off your butt and actually publish. Because if you haven't gotten it out there in 3 years, the longer you wait, every year it becomes farther and farther away from reality that it's actually going to be published in something. So having that embargo sometimes helps people as, oh, I have a time frame that if I have 3 years that this has to actually get to a publisher and get out there, or I need to let it go and just let it be published through ProQuest and through the UNLV Digital Archive. Finally, on the publishing note for research, something to be mindful of, and this is something that's come up recently, are these things called predatory journals. When you get your thesis or dissertation completed, you're going to get, or when you graduate from this institution, there's a good probability you're going to get an email, and the email is going to be from one company that does it. I'm forgetting their proper name, but their initials, they go by LAP, L-A-P. And they're going to say, hey, do you want to make money off your thesis or dissertation? And they'll give you the opportunity to have them publish your work. Now, when they publish your work, essentially what you're doing is you're signing over the rights to your work for 3 years, and then you're paying for the privilege of having them print your work for you. And there's a small chance it may be published, it may not be published. More than likely it's not going to be published through Amazon. And then the third aspect of it that's very problematic is once you've signed the paperwork and once you've submitted your final copy to them, if you want to make any changes, they're going to charge you money. Rule number one, if you're publishing, they should not charge you money. If they charge you money, it's a red flag. Academic publishers usually don't pay you money, but they don't charge you money either. They're not going to charge you money for editing. They're not going to charge you money for any of that. They're going to vet your work. It's going to vet through a peer system, or multiple readers are going to read it and see, is this actually valuable enough to be published? And it'll go from there. So any offer that comes online from the internet is, which would never happen, because the internet never, ever, ever sends you offers. There are no Nigerian princes, there are no magic pills. It's all real. It's all real. So if you get an offer online of, hey, I want to publish your work, and you're going to make lots of money, and it doesn't have to be vetted, and it doesn't have to be peer reviewed, it's too good to be true, delete the email. Tell your friends, delete the email. If it's one of those things you really want to publish, it's really easy to publish your own work now on Amazon or through a publishing company. It's not hard at all. It's not expensive at all. If you want to publish, if you really just want to self-publish, it'll cost you less than $100 to self-publish and like print off book copies for yourself. It's not an expensive process. It's not an expensive process to put your work up on Amazon and sell it by yourself as an individual entrepreneur. It's not. And then in conclusion, just as like a shout out for the graduate college, and we now have we're in the process of expanding our resources. So as our new website comes online, which will hopefully happen this semester, knock on wood, or whatever this is. Will hopefully happen, so there's going to be lots of resources online that you'll have access to. One of the resources that we did roll out this semester is the checklist for theses and dissertations, which is verbatim what we look at when we're reviewing your document, and we just go down the checklist. So if you just want to go down the checklist on your document, it'll save you some time. Our due dates are set up through summer 2016 for our deadlines for defending. So there's no excuse as to not, you have lots of time to plan. And that's it, and that's it.
Thanks, Ben. So we have plenty of time for questions and follow-up, and I'll even start off by throwing a couple items out there. One follow-up on being charged to publish an issue Meg brought up. There are open access journals that do charge. I just published something that was $2,400 in a high impact journal. They negotiated down a cheaper price, but it can be pricey. Another open access journal, I just had something accepted with a student. We then had to negotiate who pays for this, because we don't have funds set aside in a lab account or otherwise. And I'm in a better financial position than a student is, so I'm paying for it out of pocket. UNLV does not have a repository of dollars, like a bank account that we can go to for these purposes, but just be aware that this was a circumstance that you as a student might not think about when you're choosing what journals to select to publish in. Some of these do require payment, but some are predatory,
Yeah.
but some are not. So you can do your research. There's a librarian at CU Denver that has a nice list of predatory journals that you can pay attention to.
That's on our library's
Oh,
website now too, yeah, I think Jen
Okay.
Babby put it up like last year maybe.
Okay, so it's to say, which alerts you to the fact these are real considerations, because you don't want to put your work in junk journals. People will assume your work must be junk because you were preyed upon. But there are other places you will have to pay for what amount to some good journals, but you may have to negotiate the price then. A question for probably Lori. One of the issues I run into with some students is doing international work. The logistical issues of getting IRB approval in different countries differ. So, and I myself went through that in my own graduate training, working in Tanzania and Kenya, and I ended up not being able to do research in Tanzania because of IRB equivalent issues in Tanzania. But is it the student's responsibility to figure out the logistics, or should they be reliant on an advisor to lead them through this? Like, I don't know, sort of thoughts on how this tension can play out.
Yeah, I would rely on the advisor, because again, as you saw in that, when they signify their assurance that they're going to do all of these things, that they're ultimately responsible for the work that occurs outside of the U.S. There are a number of projects that we have currently that happen outside of the U.S. And so what we ask for is an IRB review in the other country, right? But oftentimes there isn't an IRB, or it's called an ethics review or something else. And in some cases where they don't have that set up, then what we ask for is a local review. So even though it can't be done by an IRB, we ask that somebody in that other country has a look at the protocol, right? And usually it's somebody from another university or a leader in the community that will look at it and say, no, this looks okay to us. So we ask for that now. So by the regulations, it's a local review. It doesn't necessarily have to be an IRB approval. But absolutely, I would rely on your PI.
So part of that, just as a follow-up then, is I have students who are working in countries where I don't know who the local contacts are, so they're the ones who have to then sort of explore things.
Right.
So then they might ask, well, should I be doing that for them, or?
Yeah, so I think with the official communication, like they could certainly, give you some leads, like this is who we would like you to contact, but anytime that students are kind of negotiating between two entities, two universities, we want it to go through the PI.
Okay.
So we recently had a case a while back where a grad student signed off on a contract. It's like, can't be doing that like in another location. So even though that student, the grad student, was in that local context, we can't have grad students binding the university to a third-party entity. Like that has to come through not even PI, but through legal as well.
Sorry, I didn't get your name.
I'm Chelcie.
Chelcie. You spoke about ownership of data. That's good. Could you speak a little more explicitly about that? Because now you've really caught. It's something I haven't really thought about.
When I said that it's my lab, it's my data.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so I mean, I'm saying so I'm signed up to do a research project. Yeah. It's been approved by the committee. I go out and gather all this data. Now, who owns it? Kind of after the fact. That's
so from my experience. Technically the university does, and following that food chain, it's when I leave here, all the data that I've collected will stay with my PI, and then anything, I'm pretty sure my PI would be able to take that data or the intellectual property with him, but ultimately because we are part of UNLV, it's technically ultimately at UNLV. That is something that you would want to talk to, or make sure you talk with your advisor about before leaving, right? There are certain project ideas that I am leaving with once I graduate that I've talked with my PI about, that it's okay if I take these ideas, these certain project lines with me that aren't necessarily set up here, but just so that's something that I have something to springboard off of once I start doing my own research. But yeah, so as a grad student, we're in this really awkward position of we do a lot of work, we collect a lot of data, but we don't technically own it.
So when it comes to rights and responsibilities of publishing, then does a professor or the PI have the right to take it and say, well, I'm going to use this? If you don't like it, you can complain, but you have no legal recourse, or you have no recourse against it.
I have seen that happen, where students have collected data, but and then they were kind of booted out of the publishing process. I I would say that is probably more rare than is the case, and if it does happen, it is something that you do have recourse, right? You can bring it up to the chair of your department, just start going up the rungs and go to the grad college to explain your situation. I believe we have an ombudsman.
Yeah.
That would help you, that you can, and even if it's something, this is why you need to talk to your PIs, your advisors, before you start stuff like this, so you know and they know that, you're on the same page once you get to that publishing authorship position. But if it does happen where the rug is just yanked out from beneath you and it's coming out of nowhere, you do have options available to you where you can fight back. You just have to, have the courage, as it were, to stand up to your advisor and kind of take on that whole process, right? Because I'm pretty sure it's a lengthy process.
Yeah, and that's one of those things where just sending a simple email of, hey, we had that conversation on Thursday, and I just wanted to outline everything to make sure that I'm clear on what my rights and responsibilities are. Can you please confirm this? Comes in handy. Because academia is kind of a little bit on the squirrely side, just a little bit. That's the point. You want that stuff in writing.
Right.
It's not like you met up with a friend at a coffee shop and you've come up with this idea. And if you go into court, you can say, well, this was my half of the idea, and this was half of the idea, and we had equal input into this concept.
Yeah.
So get stuff in writing.
Yeah, what about everything that we submitted that to the graduate college? I just put that together a couple of weeks ago, what my ideas were, what's been approved by the committee and all that. So
Yeah.
you have a copy of it somewhere. So,
Yes, so get all that in writing. And it also depends on if you, and maybe this is a better question for Lori.
I was going to say, you can build some protection into your protocol proposal form on the human subject side. Because remember, what your PI is signing off on, there's that section about where is the data going to be located. And what most people write is that it's going to be located at UNLV in a locked cabinet for 3 years. That doesn't mean that you can take it with you then, right? So one of the things that you might want to consider is making sure that you have in there as well that the student investigator may take a copy of the de-identified data upon graduation. Then you're also going to have to let your participants know that as well, because that's part of what they're signing up for. It says in there as well, oh, the data will be kept securely at UNLV. So they have the right to know if the data is traveling all over the world. So, but you can kind of build those in at the proposal stage.
So I have a question because I'm really, really new to all of this stuff. But I'm doing an internship with my hospital this summer, creating a project to reduce COPD readmissions. So my thought is I'm going to spin off of that to and create a research project out of it. But my question is what if my hospital doesn't want the data released? But they want it for their purposes, and I can use it I still can use that for my research and my professional paper, I'm assuming, right?
Yes, so the distinction is when does it become research? So class projects are not considered research or internships.
Right, I'm not trying to use the internship, but I want to spin off what I'm doing. I'm creating a booklet basically for patient education. So once that's done, what I would like to do for my research project is to do a qualitative study with the staff to get their perception on how they feel the booklet and the education process is going in reducing those readmissions.
Yeah, so the booklet's not the research. No.
The new research would be different.
Yeah.
So.
We find that in some of the educational studies as well, is that people want to try an intervention. Let's see how this works. And so they go into all this great detail about what's happening in the classroom. That's not the research.
No. The research would be the qualitative study I did with that to see how effective the book was, basically. Okay.
I have one question, and it relates to my study. I was actually asked to provide access to where my data is coming, because there's a computer system that collects the information, and I was asked to provide passwords and stuff so that people could look at it. And I'm just like, well, I can share that, but that's my account where things are coming. And so I'm like wondering, where is the line? Because I know that a separate group could be created in that particular software where everyone can look at things. But the way that it was kind of phrased was, it just made me a little bit nervous about that because I don't recall anyone else being asked to do that. So what?
Is it your PI that has to do that?
Yes, and there's another person on committee. And so I was just like, okay, where's the line there?
Mind if I?
Go
take this
ahead.
one? What I would do is I would email my PI and I would email my committee and I'd be like, I respect what you're asking for. Do you want view access or do you want editor access? If you want editor access, how do you suggest we set up safeguards so that if I get asked in the future, did anyone else have editing access to this data, or have the opportunity to change my data, you can say, no, these protocols were in place and my data was in the safe data. It's pretty much saying where's your data going to live and who's going to have access to it.
Right.
And the PI needs access to the data, right? Because it's
Right.
their project,
But
is
not
what
to
we talked
edit.
about, but not
Yeah.
to edit.
Yeah. So, the way that I had it done was where it's just shared where they could view things. And that was all, because apparently there is someone on campus who deals particularly with, they're the point person for that particular software to set up a group. So I emailed them like, well, how does this work if I want only this or this to protect the data? So I
Also
use the
look at what-
Jeopardy
yeah.
principle.
What does it say in your protocol proposal form as well, about who has access to the data? Well, if there's other people that have access to the data that could be potentially identifiable, now we're looking at non-compliance,
Okay,
right?
we'll talk a little more about that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Meg, you talked about getting release form signed for publishing images of people in your like dissertation, for example. So what if it's not the person but their organ that you're putting in there? So for example, Laura and I do our research with placenta capsules, so it's capsules that are steam dehydrated and ground up organs of participants. So is that something that I would need a release form to take a picture and put that in for a visual? I know it's really a weird question, but.
I'm gonna say no, because it's not individually identifiable.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a
Right.
face, and
Yeah.
even brain scans I've learned are
Okay.
individually, you can tell from a brain scan, oh, I know who this person is.
Yeah.
But from a ground up placenta, I can't
Yeah.
tell that it's.
Okay, yeah, there is no way I can
Yeah.
vouch for that.
It's not, it's not
Okay.
individually identifiable. It's also not in its original source, so it's not
Oh,
like,
that's a good point, yeah.
it's not like you're gonna label it, this is Jill's placenta.
No. Okay, good to know, thank you.
A more conventional question for photography. That's a really interesting thing. In my project, I'm hoping to use photography as a method of exploration and documentation as well. And I'd love to know what are the protocols I need to look into before engaging in that kind of stuff, and kind of what can be photographed. I assume we're talking about people can't be photographed, but what about places? I mean, mine will, or my research will focus around 100 circle parks. It's kind of an area that I'll be probably documenting that area for the next year or so. But what do I need to know before bringing the camera out with me?
So is there anything in IRB?
Well, he's saying not people, so like.
No, I'm saying, I mean, I very well could photograph people as well, but I mean, I'd also be photographing the parks, so kind of what's covered under.
What you're gonna wanna do is, if it's a public space, you don't really have any limitations on it.
Right.
Because people
Which
don't
I know
have an
as a photographer.
expectation of privacy.
As a photographer,
Yeah.
absolutely, I know
Yeah.
I can photograph things that I want.
So if you get people in your photographs and they're easily identifiable,
Mhm.
or if you're going to say this it's like, this is Jill's placenta, this is Jill at the park. If you're gonna name anybody, if you're gonna list anybody by name, anything that makes them identifiable. again, anything that's on private property, you're gonna want consent for the private property.
Or in public lands.
Yeah.
You'll need a permit.
Yeah.
Public lands, like parks. or-
BLM.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like national, federal.
Yeah. And then the last thing to keep in mind is, because are you taking pictures of like architecture, are you taking pictures of the change over time?
Could be all of the above.
You do have little bits, and this is where I say my magic spiel of, I am not an attorney. If you want more information on this, please consult the NRS code and a counsel, and some form of legal counsel that is barred in the state of Nevada. But generally, lots of things fall under fair use. So if you're actually using the photos for an analysis of the space, that would fall under fair use. Because you're doing something more with it. You're not just, this is my dissertation, and my dissertation is, oh, look at how cool this building is. And this is how they built this building. And
Mine probably would be a little more pointed. It could very well be, this is this person that I met,
yeah.
and here's them doing more.
Yeah, and because then that person would be identifiable, you'd want them to be like, are you fine if I identify you?
So they would need to sign some of
Yeah.
these forms. And is there a standard photographic release form, or?
There is.
There is, yeah, okay.
I have one right here.
There's
a blank one.
Okay.
Wait,
This
he's
is
not
cleared by
to go
legal?
to the RB for that, because he's actually.
Now he's interacting with you.
Yeah, well, absolutely, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
of course, yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
I'm in the process of filing, I just defended my proposal.
Yeah, what if you're using a drone with a camera on it?
You know what, let's not go there with it. So that happens, and University of North Dakota has a pretty extensive drone research program. And so people have even in public places, they have the right to know if they're being photographed in any way, shape, or form. So what they've done at UND is they've set up a perimeter, right? So it's kind of fenced off, and they have signs that say, you know, drones are in the area, you may be photographed. It's pretty interesting. But following up on what you said, I want to link to something that Megan said, is that if you're taking photos, you know, and maybe it doesn't really fall into any federal or state regulation, then let's go to the personal conviction one. If it was a photo of your sister or your family member, would you want that in somebody else's document? Like if he or she is doing something that you wouldn't necessarily want other people to know about, would you be okay with that?
Which I mean, and as a photographer, I'm always in dialogue with the people that I photograph. I never just take photos. Kind of, well, I got it, I got you.
Got it
So,
now.
I mean, I'm very much in, even outside
I'm going to
my
call
university
TNT.
work. Yeah, outside of my university work, yeah. I mean, I also I'm always in close, dialogue with the people I photograph. So, absolutely.
I have a question, in terms of getting rights and permission for use, what about the rights of descendants? Because I deal with history, I'm probably not going to be using images of a living person, but what rights and responsibilities do I have towards the descendants of people whose photographs I might use?
That's, photographs?
Yeah.
So not a living person, so the federal regulation 45 CFR 46 does not apply. It has to be a living individual.
Okay.
But, if we get into the cell line issue, then it's, it's completely different. So even though they're deceased, there are permissions perhaps that need to be. But with photographs, I think you'd be fine.
The only thing you would need to check on is if the photographs you're using are still under copyright.
Mhm.
If they're still under copyright, you'd have to cite them in your document.
Yes.
And attribute them to whoever the photographer was and the company that owns the copyright.
What about, this is getting very specific, what about testimony or an oral history? If I use someone's words, something they said, what responsibility do I have to their family? Once again, this would be with someone deceased. But like, there's a massive oral history collection here at Special Collections.
And
If I
it's
use-
publicly accessible.
Yeah.
So in that case,
Yeah.
yeah, because the permission's already been given, or
Correct.
it wouldn't be there, so, okay,
Yeah.
I got you.
But again, you need a full citation.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Let's see, patterns I can see today are, as student researchers, there are points of contact primarily with your advisor or advisors, but then you get up into other institutional layers, and then there's the federal layer. And then you just have the more abstract ethical piece guiding what you're doing. But all of these are points of both support and potential tension. What if something does go awry though? What is the process? We touched on this briefly, but could we just focus for a minute too on what that formal process would look like if there is need for a grievance, let's say?
We'll all look at me.
Well, there are so many different kinds of grievances that could happen, it's hard.
How about some hypothetical examples?
I have one.
All right.
It was mean to ask. So like we've talked about how your PI is always in control of your research and always has to be accessible. And I know it happens, life happens, and suddenly your PI doesn't respond to your emails ever. So like what if something like that?
So your PA doesn't respond to your emails ever. Well, at that point, you'd want to talk to your, first of all, you want to document this. Because responding to your emails ever can be a very broad statement. It's like, I sent you an email 3 months ago and I forgot about it, and you just didn't respond, versus I'm emailing you every single week and you're not responding. You would take a stack of those, you would take documentation of those emails to the graduate college. Well, you've got multiple avenues. Avenue one is go to your graduate coordinator. If your chair and your graduate coordinator are the same person, or if you don't feel like your graduate coordinator is fully hearing you on this issue, you can go to the graduate college and you can speak to Valerie Burke. She is the director of student services. If you don't feel that you would be, if you don't feel comfortable, or if you don't feel that you'd be properly heard in the graduate college for some reason, you can always then go to the campus ombudsman, who is kind of this third-party position where you would just bring up issues to discuss. You can file, if you're worried your advisor for some reason is misappropriating your work or going against the standards and protocols that were laid out in your IRB paperwork, you can always contact the IRB. And then there's always just, you can sit down with your PI and be like, hi, I know you're really not good with email. I understand that. Can you at least, but to feel comfortable, this is what I need. And you can clearly express what you need, because this is a relationship. And if it's not working, it's a hassle, but you can always you can always start from square one and find a different PI. You can get a new chair. That's part of the reason why when you're setting up your committee, it's always a good idea to not just grab the first person walking down the hallway to be your chair, and you want to kind of interview people, treat it like dating. It's like, do you mesh? Do you have similar personalities? Do you like similar research? Does this person have the time for you? And make sure that you're going to have a clear channel of communication, and you're going to have similar ethics and values, so that you'll have a positive relationship.
I'm going to add two more things.
Okay.
So if it's IRB and you feel perhaps that you're not being supervised, or your PI is asking you to do things that are not in the protocol and you're not comfortable with that, on our website, the Research Integrity website, there's report a concern anonymously. Those come directly to me. No one else sees those, and I'm obligated to follow up on every single one that I get. Sometimes it's just a phone call and it's I've received a complaint, and it could be anybody. I mean, so I don't know who it is, and we have received complaints, and I have followed up on them. So that would be an additional step that you could perhaps look at if it's IRB related. But then there's also, as Megan said, your committee. You've got a grad college rep, right? So I'm a GCR in a number of committees, and I've had students come to me when they have had difficulty. And it's not that I can solve things, but I can help for your grad college rep, because one of our roles is to make sure that you're treated fairly. Right, Megan?
Yep.
Yeah.
One of the roles of the graduate college rep is you're treated fairly, and that's why it's so important that your grad college rep is not within your department, and why we're really strict on that rule is they can have similar interests as your the rest of your committee and as the topic you're going on, but it's important that they're outside the influence of your committee. So if something's going wrong, they can step up and say, hey, this isn't cool, and they don't have to worry about ramifications of seeing.
See, and I had it explained to me the complete opposite about my department, which was the grad college represented the grad college because the grad college didn't trust the department. Was the way it was explained to me straight out.
No, the grad college rep is actually there on, they have three purposes. One purpose is they're there to protect the student.
Yeah, never heard that one.
They're there to protect the student. They are there to protect the graduate college. They're there to protect the academic integrity of the institution. So if, let's say, the graduate college rep would then have the power to step in and say, you know, I really don't think that a 3-page poem is enough for a doctoral thesis. You know, I think that's really uncool. They would have that power to step in and say, this is not rigorous enough to actually earn this degree. And that's good for the institution as a whole, especially as we go on to Tier 1. And the third way, they actually protect the department, because they're there, not that any of you would ever do this. There's like 1 or 2 slight examples that have happened in the past, but not that any of you would do this. Where the student has issues and the student isn't functioning well. And that graduate college rep then has the ability to stand up for the department and say, yeah, these 3 committee members from the department are saying so-and-so is not pulling their workload on this doctoral thesis, on this thesis or dissertation, and the graduate college rep as an outsider can then back that up and say, yes, this person needs to be put on probation, or this person needs to step it up, or this person needs some form of counseling to help them along in the process.
I'd like to add conversely, if your department is asking for like another 2 years worth of work that your representative doesn't think is necessary, they can intervene and be like, I feel like this is more than enough, and you know, so I have something else to
And I'll follow up both on Chelcie and Meg's point too. About these are relationships with your advisors. So what are the responsibilities you hold as a student researcher? I expect students to be in good, clear communication with me. It's not okay just to go AWOL for a month and not feel like contacting me or following up on things we talked about that you were going to do, and then just let them drop and think that's okay. So it is a two-way street. So a lot of what we've talked about today is emphasize things that there may be problems that arise and what kind of recourse do you have, but also think of the flip side. Imagine you're supervising someone, perhaps you mentor an undergraduate student, or in the lab, for example. How do you like to be treated? You know, it's the flip side of that same coin. So you're beholden to be in good, clear communication with your advisor and make sure explicit discussions about what those expectations are, and everyone will be happier and better off over the long haul, having that good, clear, open channel of communication.
And that's one of the RCR sections. So Kate Corrigan, the graduate dean, spends an entire hour on the mentor-trainee relationship. She does a great job, as you can imagine.
So any last thoughts? We're just about 11:30. Any last wrap-ups? Any Nobel Prize or Pulitzer Prize winning research here? We'll find out soon, right?
Not yet, not yet.
Well, thanks everyone. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks for everyone for